Elder Choya stood at the fence line with a rifle across his forearms, not raised, not lowered, just held, the way a man holds something he hopes he won't need. 3 riders came up the dry wash toward his land, dust rising behind them like smoke off a grass fire, and the man in front held a folded paper high over his head as if it were a white flag instead of what it truly was, a deed of sale, already signed by a hand that was not his own. The morning had started ordinary enough, the kind of morning that gives no warning at all of what it's about to demand from a man. Choya had drawn water before sunrise, fed the 2 goats that still remembered his wife's voice better than they remembered his, and walked the fence line the way he did every day, checking each post the way another man might check on a sleeping child. He had not expected riders. He never did anymore, not since the last offer 3 months back, but a man who has been surprised too many times learns to keep a rifle close even on the quiet mornings. $50, Choya, the lead rider called out, reining up short of the fence. More than fair for land that won't grow you another season of corn. He said it kindly, the way a man says something cruel when he wants to be forgiven for it later. Choya did not answer right away. He had heard this offer in a dozen different mouths over 3 summers, the banker's mouth, the preacher's mouth, even the sheriff's, all of them dressed up as kindness, all of them wanting the same 6 acres along the creek that never ran dry, not even in the driest August anyone could remember. Men who had never once dug a channel by hand seemed to know, with great certainty, exactly what his land was worth and exactly when he ought to give up on it. "You'll starve out here alone," the rider pressed, leaning forward in his saddle now, sensing the silence as an opening rather than a refusal. "Everybody in town knows it. We're only trying to help you before winter does what we're too polite to." Something in the word help made the old man's jaw tighten, the only sign he gave that the word had struck something old and raw in him. He had been helped before. Helped off land his grandfather had walked. Helped onto a reservation ration line that fed him less than a dog. Helped, once, into a grave that wasn't his own, standing beside it while a man in a black coat explained, gently, that this too was for the best. He had learned, the hard way a man learns things that cost him everything, that when help arrived on horseback with a paper already signed, it was never help at all. "Get off my water," was all he said, and it was enough. The riders turned their horses, muttering the kind of things men mutter when they've been refused something they believed they were owed, and rode back toward town, back toward the saloon where they would tell anyone who'd listen that the old Apache out past Cutter's Ridge had finally lost his mind, refusing $50 for land that would kill him anyway. None of them knew what the well beneath his land actually meant. None of them knew what he had buried beside it, 17 years ago, when he still had a wife and a reason to believe the ground could keep a promise. And none of them, not the banker, not the preacher, not the sheriff, would be the one standing beside Choya when the truth of that water finally rose to the surface. Choya watched the riders shrink into dust on the horizon, then turned back toward the well, resting his hand briefly on the small stone marker beside it, the way he did most mornings without quite meaning to. It was a habit older than he could remember starting. 17 years of mornings, 17 years of the same quiet weight settling into his chest before he could shake it off enough to begin the day's work. A stranger would be the one to finally understand it. A cowboy nobody in town trusted either, riding in from the south with nothing but a bay horse, a canteen gone dry 2 days past, and a habit of asking questions before he ever offered an opinion, though on the morning the riders left, Choya did not yet know that the man was already less than a day's ride away, following a trail he had chosen for no better reason than that it looked like it might lead to water. His name was Caleb Doss, and he had not come looking for trouble, or for an old man's water, or for anything at all beyond a place to fill his canteen before his horse gave out from under him. He'd been riding for 6 days since leaving a ranch job that ended the way most of his jobs ended, with him refusing to look away from something a foreman wanted looked past, in that case a boy half-starved and worked past sundown for wages he'd never see. Caleb had said his piece to the foreman, quiet and plain, and had been told to collect his pay and ride on before sundown. Caleb had a habit like that. It had cost him 3 jobs in 2 years, and he had made a kind of peace with it, the way a man makes peace with a limp he can't cure but has learned to walk with anyway. He did not consider himself brave. He simply could not make himself look away from a thing once he had already seen it clearly, and that, more than any other quality, had shaped the whole crooked path of his life so far. By the second day without a full canteen, pride had stopped mattering much. He followed a thin game trail toward a stand of cottonwoods on the horizon, the kind of green that in that country meant only one thing, and by late afternoon he came upon a fence line, a modest adobe house, and an old man standing beside a well with a rifle held loose but ready across his forearms. When he reached Choya's fence, the old man was already watching him, had been watching since he first appeared as a shimmer of heat on the horizon, rifle still resting across his forearms, though this time there was no urgency in the way he held it. Just habit. Just a man who had learned that strangers on horseback rarely came for good reason. Water, Caleb said simply, nodding toward the well. I'll work for it, if you've got work. Don't need charity. That single sentence did something the $50 never could. Choya lowered the rifle an inch, studying the younger man the way he might study a print in the dirt before deciding whether it belonged to something dangerous. He took in the empty canteen, the horse's dry lips, the way the stranger's eyes went first to the well and only after to the house, as though he had learned somewhere that a man's thirst mattered more than his manners. You don't ask why an old Indian lives alone out here, Choya said. It wasn't quite a question. Figure that's your business, Caleb answered. Man's got a right to his own reasons. It was such a small thing to say. But no one, not the banker, not the sheriff, not even the missionary who came twice a year to save souls he'd already decided were lost, had ever said anything close to it. They asked why. They asked how. They asked when he'd finally give up and move on. Nobody had simply granted him the right to keep his reasons to himself, and something in Choya's chest loosened, just slightly, at hearing it. Choya opened the gate. That first night, Choya set out a second plate at the fire without being asked, sliding it across the dirt toward Caleb with no ceremony at all, as though it were simply the natural order of things and not the first time in 7 years he had cooked for anyone besides himself. Caleb noticed. He said nothing about it, only ate, and something in that silence told Choya the younger man understood exactly what the gesture had cost him to make. Over the following days, Caleb mended fence posts and cleared brush from the irrigation channel Choya had dug by hand years before, a narrow vein of water that fed 6 acres of corn and beans no one in town believed could survive out there. He worked without being told twice, and without complaint even when the sun turned the shovel handle too hot to hold bare-handed. In the evenings, Choya would sit by the fire and speak little, but what he did say, Caleb noticed, always carried the weight of something practiced, something repeated to himself so many times it had worn smooth, like a river stone. Water finds its own way, the old man said one night, watching the small channel glisten faintly under starlight. You can damn it, you can curse it, you can try to sell it to a man who never dug for it himself. But it goes where it was always meant to go. Same as people. Caleb didn't understand it then, not fully. He only knew it settled into him the way certain sentences do, quietly, and permanently, the kind of thing a man carries without noticing the weight of it until much later. Over the weeks that followed, the two men fell into a rhythm neither had expected nor asked for, an old man who had buried too much to trust easily, and a young cowboy who had lost enough jobs standing up for people that trust came to him like a habit he couldn't break. They worked the fields together at dawn before the heat became unbearable, mended what the desert wore down, and shared meals of beans and cornbread that Caleb learned to cook the way Choya's wife once had, from instructions the old man gave haltingly, as though each one cost him something to remember. Neither called it friendship. But it was becoming something neither of them could easily walk away from, and both of them, in their own quiet way, had begun to notice it. One evening Caleb asked, carefully, about the stone marker beside the well. Choya only shook his head and said, "Not yet," and Caleb, true to the promise he'd made without ever speaking it, let the question go and never raised it again until Choya himself was ready. It was a small thing, that restraint, but it was the kind of small thing that builds trust slower and sturdier than any grand gesture ever could. Word travels fast in a town with little else to talk about, and it wasn't long before the sight of a white cowboy working an old Apache's land became the only subject worth discussing at the saloon. The banker, Elias Ford, who had sent the first offer, took it personally, as if Caleb's presence were an insult aimed directly at him, a reminder that his $50 had not been enough to close the matter the way he had expected. "You're wasting your back on a dead man's land," Ford told Caleb one afternoon in town, leaning against the mercantile post with the particular smugness of a man who had never once had to work for anything he owned. "Old fool won't sell, won't leave, and come the first hard frost, that water of his will freeze same as any other. Then what'll you have to show for it? I'll have 6 acres that fed a man for 17 years when nobody else believed it could," Caleb said, and walked past him without waiting for a reply. Ford's face went the color of a man unused to being dismissed, and he said nothing further that day, though the silence he left behind carried its own kind of threat, the sort a town learns to recognize before it fully understands what it means. Later that same afternoon, the mercantile owner's wife pulled Caleb aside near the feed store, her voice low and careful, the way people speak when they mean to be kind but are also afraid of being seen being kind. "You seem a decent sort," she said. "Decent men in this town learn quick which fights are worth losing everything over." Caleb thanked her for the concern and bought his supplies anyway, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes following him back to his horse, not hostile exactly, just watchful, the way a town watches a man it hasn't yet decided what to make of. 2 nights later, someone rode past Choya's land in the dark and cut the fence line clean through, driving what few cattle Choya kept straight into the irrigation channel, collapsing the narrow banks the old man had shaped by hand over 2 decades. By the time Caleb woke to the sound of hooves and shouting, the riders were already gone, leaving behind only broken fence posts and a channel filled with churned mud where clean water had run the evening before. Choya said nothing when he found it at dawn. He simply knelt beside the ruined channel, running his fingers along the broken earth the way another man might touch a wound on someone he loved. Caleb had never seen him look older than he did in that moment, not frail, but tired in a way that went back further than that single morning, tired in the way of a man who has had to rebuild the same thing too many times in one lifetime. "They think if they break enough of it," Choya said quietly, "I'll finally believe I never should have kept it." "Then we rebuild it," Caleb said. "Today. Both of us." They worked through the heat of the day without stopping, reshaping the channel stone by stone, hauling water by hand where the flow had stalled entirely, and by the time the sun dropped behind the mesas, the water was running clean again, slower than before, but running. Choya watched it move past his boots and said nothing for a long while, his hands still raw from the work. "Most men," he finally said, "would have told me to give up by now. Would have agreed with the banker just to end the trouble. Wouldn't be much of a man if I did," Caleb answered, and went back to setting the last of the stones. Word of the sabotage reached the sheriff, who rode out 2 days later, looked over the damage with mild interest, and did nothing but suggest, gently, that Choya consider the banker's offer before something worse happened. It was the same help, wearing the same disguise, and this time it came for Caleb too, a quiet warning that a man who sided with an old Apache over the town's respectable citizens might find work harder to come by, doors harder to open, from here to the territory line. Caleb didn't leave. He only asked the sheriff, plainly, whether cutting a man's fence and driving his cattle into his own water supply counted as a crime in this county, or only an inconvenience for men with the wrong last name. The sheriff had no answer for that, and rode back to town with his warning unheeded. The first hard frost came early that year, biting down on the land 2 full weeks before anyone expected it, and with it came the true test of everything Choya had refused to abandon. The corn, already thin from the sabotage, browned overnight. The channel Caleb and Choya had rebuilt held, but barely, water inching along at half its old pace, not enough to carry 6 acres through a real winter, and both men knew it without needing to say so aloud. It was on the coldest of those nights that Choya finally spoke the truth he had buried 17 years before, the truth no offer of $50, no banker's paper, no sheriff's warning had ever come close enough to touch. "My wife is buried beside that well," Choya said, staring into the fire, his voice steadier than Caleb had ever heard it, as though the words had waited a long time for someone worth saying them to. 17 years. She asked me, before the fever took her, never to let the water stop running past where she rests. Said as long as it moved, some part of her was still moving too. Caleb sat very still, understanding all at once why $50, why 100, why any number a banker could write on paper had never once been enough, and why every offer had landed on Choya not as generosity but as an insult dressed in politeness. I used to think keeping it running was about her, Choya went on, his voice dropping lower. Now I think it was about learning whether I could still keep a promise at all, after everything else had been taken from me without my say. Every year I kept that water moving, I proved something to myself the town never gave me credit for. That's not land to you, Caleb said quietly. That's a promise. A promise, Choya repeated, testing the word, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone he has carried a long time without ever quite setting it down. Yes. Neither man spoke for a long while after that. The fire cracked and settled, and somewhere out past the frostbitten corn, the water kept moving, slow and thin but alive, past a stone marker Caleb had never asked about and now understood he never needed to. The next morning, Caleb rode into town before first light and returned by noon leading 2 horses loaded with lumber, pipe, and a hand pump he'd traded his saddle and 6 months' future wages to secure, everything he owned that could be turned into something Choya's land actually needed. He had not slept the night before, not from worry but from a kind of certainty that had settled into him somewhere between the fire dying down and the sky turning gray. I didn't ask for this, Choya said, standing at the gate, something unreadable crossing his weathered face as he took in the loaded horses. Didn't ask you, Caleb said. This isn't help. It's a promise I'm keeping too, now. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, Choya's composure broke, not into words, but into a long, silent nod, the kind a man gives when speech would only diminish what he actually felt. He turned away for a moment, toward the stone marker, and when he turned back his eyes were clearer than Caleb had ever seen them, as though some old weight had finally been set down and he had only just now noticed how long he'd carried it. Together they built what the well alone could never manage, a hand-pumped line running straight from the deepest part of the water table to the edge of the cornfield, bypassing the fragile channel entirely, giving the land a chance no frost could take from it overnight. They worked through 3 days of biting cold, breaking ice from the ground each morning before they could begin, and on the 3rd evening, when the pump finally drew water clean and steady, neither man said a word. They simply stood and watched it run. The banker rode out one final time when the pump was finished, expecting to find a man broken enough to finally sign. Instead he found 6 acres green under frost, a stone marker no longer at risk of running dry, and 2 men standing shoulder to shoulder at the fence line who no longer needed his $50 or his false kindness. Ford opened his mouth as if to offer some new argument, looked at the pump, looked at the 2 men, and closed it again. He left without a word, and never rode out that way again. The town took longer to change than the banker did. For a time, whispers still followed Caleb into the mercantile, still followed Choya whenever he came in for supplies he no longer strictly needed but bought anyway, just to be seen buying them like any other rancher in the valley. But whispers, Caleb had learned, could not survive long against 6 green acres in a year everyone else's crops had struggled, and slowly, the way ice gives before spring whether it wants to or not, the town's suspicion thawed into something closer to grudging respect. By the following spring, the frost long behind them and the worst of the town's suspicion behind them too, the corn stood taller than it had in a decade, and the small stone marker beside the well sat surrounded by wildflowers that had pushed up through soil no one had believed could still give life. Caleb never did leave, not truly. He built a second room onto the adobe house with his own hands, and the 2 men who had started as stranger and landowner had become, without either ever saying the word aloud, something closer to family. One evening, sitting together beside the channel they had rebuilt with their own hands, Choya watched the water move steadily past the marker and finally understood the words he had spoken to Caleb that first cold night on the porch, so long ago it felt like another life. Water finds its own way, Choya said again, softer this time, watching it catch the last light of the day. So did you. Caleb didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Some promises, he had learned, were kept not in words but in the quiet, steady work of staying, through frost, through sabotage, through every man in town who mistook control for kindness. He had ridden in looking only for water to fill an empty canteen. He left, years later when his own time finally came, having filled something in himself he hadn't known was empty. The land is still there today, the story goes, 6 green acres along a creek that has never once run dry, tended now by the children Caleb and the family he built came to call their own, the water still moving steadily past a small stone marker that nobody in town has ever again offered $50 to disturb. If you were in Caleb's boots, would you have traded your saddle and half a year's wages for a promise that wasn't even yours to keep? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to Dustland Legends for more untold histories of the frontier. See you in the next story.